Retrogression Alert. State Department warns. March 2026, gains for India and China could be temporary. The number came out on a Wednesday morning, and for about 48 hours, the phones inside immigration law offices across the country did not stop ringing. A priority date movement that thousands of Indian and Chinese nationals had been waiting years, in some cases more than a decade, to see. A forward shift in the Visa Bulletin that felt, for a brief window, like the system was finally releasing some of its pressure. But buried inside the same document that announced those gains was a sentence that most people skipped over. A warning sentence. A sentence that the State Department does not include casually. And that sentence said, in the careful technical language of federal immigration policy, that the forward movement seen in the March 2026 Visa Bulletin for employment-based categories affecting India and China could be temporary. This did not unfold over months. It was communicated in a single bulletin, a bulletin that could pull back dates that workers have already used to file adjustment of status applications, a bulletin that could freeze families mid-process with no warning, a bulletin that could strand people in a legal limbo that has no clean exit. One misread of this bulletin, one assumption that a forward movement is permanent, and you could spend thousands of dollars on a filing that gets rejected or delayed because the dates retrogressed before USCIS processed your case. What the State Department signaled crossed a threshold that employment-based immigration watchers had been hoping would hold through the rest of the fiscal year. And when that threshold wavered, attorneys, advocates, and the people living inside this backlog did not wait. They responded with alarm, with analysis, and with a scramble to understand what comes next. Most people see a forward date movement and celebrate. They assume progress means stability. That assumption is the trap. Today, you are going to understand exactly why that trap exists and how to avoid it. For several months now, there had been quiet signals. Not from official State Department press briefings, not from USCIS policy memoranda, just signals that the employment-based visa number consumption rate for fiscal year 2025 was running ahead of projections. The State Department has been forward-leaning in its Visa Bulletin movements this fiscal year, yes, but also inconsistent in that approach. The monthly bulletins had followed a rhythm, a careful calibration, almost a controlled release of date movement designed to absorb demand without triggering the kind of mass filing surge that exhausts annual visa numbers before September 30th. But what triggered concern among immigration practitioners this cycle was that the rhythm suddenly showed strain. Visa lawyers who track the monthly bulletin movements and cross-reference them against USCIS filing data recognize the indicators. The acceleration of forward date movement in categories that historically move slowly. The unusually large jumps in the EB2 India and EB3 India final action dates in recent months. The simultaneous forward movement in China employment-based categories that had been stalled for extended periods. The sudden language in the March 2026 bulletin warning that current gains may not hold. And when the State Department starts hedging its own bulletin language, it means the annual visa number supply is under pressure. In the early weeks of the March 2026 bulletin cycle, State Department analysts released what Visa Bulletin watchers described as a cautionary framing around forward date movements, including language about potential retrogression not seen in this specific form in recent fiscal year bulletins. These are signals the State Department only embeds when communicating something specific. That demand is outpacing the available supply of visa numbers for the remainder of the fiscal year. That the forward movements shown in the current bulletin were made in anticipation of demand that may exceed projections. Or that USCIS filing volumes in response to the date movement have already triggered a consumption acceleration that makes retrogression mathematically likely before the fiscal year closes on September 30th. Observers weren't certain which scenario was dominant, or whether all three were converging at once, but one thing was clear. The State Department was managing expectations in a way that signaled instability. And when that happens mid-fiscal year, every person waiting in the employment-based backlog needs to pay attention immediately. The warning embedded in the March 2026 Visa Bulletin was not routine bulletin language. It was not the standard disclaimer language that appears every month about cutoff dates being subject to change. It was a specific, forward-looking caution addressed directly at the gains made for India and China in the employment-based categories. Immigration attorneys, after emergency client calls, described the bulletin as surprising in its candor, concerning in its timing, and most importantly, actionable in a way that demands an immediate response from anyone who is eligible to file or is mid-process in their adjustment of status case. The State Department does not include retrogression warnings because it wants to. It includes them because the data inside the visa number consumption model is telling it something that it cannot ignore. The response from the immigration legal community was among the most rapid and coordinated seen in employment visa bulletin history in recent memory. Multiple immigration law organizations confirmed that practitioners launched immediate client outreach campaigns targeting individuals with priority dates that had become newly current, including applicants in EB2 India and EB3 India categories that had recently moved forward after years of stagnation that analysts believe was caused by the natural consumption drag of the COVID-era processing backlog finally clearing. They acted before the window could close. They targeted applicants who had priority dates newly within the final action date range. They targeted beneficiaries whose employers had not yet filed I-485 adjustment of status applications despite the date availability. They targeted derivative beneficiaries, spouses and children, connected to principal applicants whose dates had moved but whose secondary filings had not yet been submitted. This wasn't a precautionary advisory. It was a genuine race against a closing window. And that is what made the State Department's warning so operationally significant for the people it affects. Let me explain the mechanics of what is happening here in terms that don't require an immigration law degree to understand. The United States issues a limited number of employment-based green cards each fiscal year. The annual cap is approximately 140,000 visas across all employment-based categories combined. Within that total, each country is subject to a per-country limit that prevents any single country from consuming more than 7% of the annual total. Because India and China have historically produced enormous volumes of employment-based petitions, particularly in the EB2 and EB3 categories driven by the technology and engineering sectors. Both countries face wait times that stretch far beyond what workers from other countries experience. An Indian national filing an EB2 petition today may be waiting 20, 30, or in some projections, 50 or more years before their priority date becomes current under the final action date chart. The Visa Bulletin manages this reality by publishing 2 charts each month. The final action dates chart shows when USCIS can actually approve a green card application. The dates for filing chart shows when applicants can submit their I-485 adjustment of status application, which locks in critical benefits, including employment authorization and travel permission, even before the final approval is possible. When the State Department publishes forward movement in either of these charts, it is releasing a controlled amount of eligibility window to a population that has been waiting for years. The March 2026 bulletin moved those windows forward and then told everyone that the movement might not last. Here is why the retrogression warning carries consequences that go beyond simple anxiety about dates. When a priority date retrogresses, meaning it moves backward in a subsequent month's bulletin, anyone who filed an I-485 adjustment of status application based on the dates for filing chart, but whose final action date has not yet been reached, enters a state of pending limbo. Their application was properly filed. It is accepted by USCIS, and they retain the benefits that come with a pending I-485, including the ability to apply for an employment authorization document and an advance parole travel document. This is significant protection, but they cannot receive their green card approval until their final action date becomes current again. And if retrogression is severe, that could mean waiting additional months or years for the date to advance back to where it was. The worst outcome in a retrogression scenario is not for the person who filed. It is for the person who was eligible to file, whose date had moved forward into the available window, and who did not submit their application before the date moved back. That person loses the window entirely. They go back to waiting without the protection of a pending I-485. They lose the employment authorization flexibility. They lose the travel document protection. They are back in the queue with nothing but the priority date they established when their employer originally filed the I-140 petition. I want to address the specific categories that are most affected by what the March 2026 bulletin is signaling. The EB2 India category has been the most volatile in recent cycles. The final action date for EB2 India had been showing movement earlier in fiscal year 2025 and into 2026 after a long period of near stagnation. If retrogression materializes, this category's final action date could pull back significantly, potentially by months, potentially more, depending on how aggressive USCIS processing has been in consuming visa numbers. The EB3 India category faces similar pressure. There has historically been significant EB3 to EB2 upgrade filing activity. Workers who originally filed under EB3 and later refiled under EB2 to potentially move faster, and the simultaneous demand from both directions strains the India quota. For China, the EB2 and EB3 categories have seen similar patterns of forward movement that the State Department is now flagging as potentially unsustainable through the remainder of the fiscal year. The EB1 category, which covers priority workers, outstanding professors and researchers, and multinational managers, has generally moved faster and with more stability. But even EB1 for India has experienced pressure when overall visa number consumption is elevated. Now, I want to speak directly to the three types of people watching this right now, because the right action is different depending on where you are in this process. If your priority date is currently within the dates for filing chart for your category and country, and you have not yet submitted your I-485, the question you need to answer today, not next week, today, is whether your employer's immigration counsel has evaluated your eligibility to file. If the answer is yes and filing has not happened, you need to understand why. If it is a documentation issue, work to resolve it immediately. If it is a fee authorization issue, escalate it with your employer's HR or legal team. If it is simply that nobody realized the window was open, that conversation needs to happen today. If your priority date is within the final action dates chart, meaning USCIS can actually approve your green card right now, and your I-485 has already been filed, the retrogression warning affects you differently. You are protected. Your pending application locks in your benefits. What you need to monitor is whether your final action date retrogresses before USCIS gets to your case, which would delay the actual approval but not eliminate your pending status. If your priority date has not yet reached either chart, if you are still years away from being able to file, the retrogression news affects you indirectly but importantly. It tells you something about how the system is managing overall demand, and it should inform how you think about your long-term planning and any decisions you are making about employer changes, geographic moves, or alternative immigration pathways. There is a harder conversation that this bulletin forces into the open, and I want to have it directly. The employment-based green card backlog for India is not a bureaucratic inconvenience. It is a generational injustice embedded in a statutory framework that Congress has not meaningfully reformed in decades. Workers from India are filing petitions today, knowing that their children may age out of dependent status before a green card is ever approved. Workers are making career decisions, family decisions, and life decisions based on a priority date that functions as an unpredictable variable in every single plan they make. The retrogression warning in the March 2026 bulletin is not just a calendar problem. It is a reminder that the legal status of hundreds of thousands of people who have lived in the United States for years, in some cases for a decade or more, remains fragile and dependent on a system that was not designed to handle the volume it now faces. Advocacy for legislative reform, including country cap elimination or significant redistribution of unused visa numbers, remains the only structural solution. And while Congress has not acted with the urgency this situation demands, the people navigating this backlog cannot afford to wait for legislative action before making the best decisions available to them under the current rules. As this fiscal year continues, more data will emerge about whether the March 2026 forward movements hold, retrogress partially, or collapse entirely before September 30th. The April Bulletin, expected to release in the final weeks of March, will be the first real indicator of whether the State Department follows through on its retrogression warning or whether demand projections stabilize enough to hold the current dates. Watch that bulletin with the same urgency you brought to this one. But one thing is already clear. Knowing this right now does not make you an alarmist. It makes you prepared. It means you are not going to miss a filing window because you assumed forward movement was permanent. It means your family's protection inside this system is not left to chance or to the assumption that someone else is watching on your behalf. Share this video with every Indian and Chinese national you know who is waiting in the employment-based backlog. Share it with their spouses, their adult children who are approaching age-out risk, and the HR and legal teams at their employers who need to understand why urgency matters right now. It might be the most consequential thing you send them this year. Subscribe to Visa Status Radar for more protection. We protect you with real information as the next phase of this bulletin cycle unfolds.